When you picture a serial killer, you probably imagine a lone wolf, right? Some monster hiding out in the shadows, all by himself. But what if that classic image is just plain wrong? Today, we're going to dive into the really unsettling world of killer couples and try to figure out the psychology that can possibly turn two people into one single homicidal team. So let's just start with a number that completely shatters that lone wolf idea. Get this. Studies show that a staggering 26% of all serial killers do not act alone. They have a partner. Just let that sink in for a second. More than 1 in every 4. This isn't some rare freak occurrence. It's a huge and frankly terrifying part of the whole phenomenon. And that, of course, raises a pretty chilling question. I mean, if most of us struggle to agree on what to watch on Netflix, what kind of dark psychological glue could create a bond so strong that two people decide to commit the most horrific acts you can imagine, together? Let's break down how that can even happen. Okay, so to understand the team, we first have to understand the individual parts. Before these people ever even meet, they're already on a very dark path, one that's been paved by a really specific and nasty cocktail of trauma and psychological damage. And here's a really crucial point. For a lot of these individuals, murder isn't something they would have ever done on their own. It's the combination of two very specific, very damaged personalities that creates this explosive result. In this messed up equation, 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2. It equals something far, far worse. So, what's one of the main ingredients in this recipe? Well, according to Robert Hale's social learning theory, it often kicks off with a profound sense of humiliation. Think about it from a kid's perspective. You seek approval from a parent. It's a basic, expected reward. But when you don't get that, and instead you're met with abuse or rejection, it creates this intense frustration. We're not just talking about feeling bad here. This is a deep psychological wound. All that bottled up rage has to go somewhere, right? But the person is often way too afraid to confront the source of that humiliation, like an abusive parent. So they use this psychological trick called transference. That aggression gets redirected onto scapegoats, people who are less threatening but who kind of look like or remind them of their original tormentor. A famous chilling example is Ted Bundy, who went after victims who resembled the ex-fiancé that had rejected him. And we can actually see how this whole thing spirals thanks to Hickey's trauma control model. See, it all starts with some kind of trauma that can lead to dissociation, which is like a detachment from reality. To cope with the terrible self-esteem from that trauma, the person retreats into these really violent fantasies. And over time, those fantasies just get reinforced, becoming more and more intense until eventually they cross that final line into actual homicidal behavior. This is the broken foundation of one half of our future team. So here we have one deeply damaged person totally locked in this cycle of fantasy and rage. But they're still missing a critical piece of the puzzle. And, weirdly enough, it's something every single one of us is looking for. I mean, you have to wonder, right? After a whole life of rejection, after building this fortress of violent fantasy around yourself, what could you possibly want from another human being? Well, the answer is surprisingly and disturbingly human. The answer, it turns out, lies in this idea called the theory of the relational self. This theory basically argues that none of us exist in a vacuum. Who we think we are, our sense of self, what drives us, our feeling of worth, it's all profoundly shaped by our connections to significant others, like our parents, our friends, and our partners. And here's the absolute bottom line. If you strip everything else away, the most basic human drive we have is the need for connection. Even for someone this far down a dark path, that need for approval, for belonging, for someone to get them, it's still there. But by now, it's become deeply, deeply twisted. And this is where it all comes together. When one person with this warped need for connection finds another just like them, they don't just form a friendship. They forge a deadly alliance. So instead of bonding over movies or music, they start to bond over their shared trauma and their dark fantasies. And for the first time in their lives, probably, when they share their most violent, awful thoughts, they don't get rejected. They get a thumbs up. They get encouragement. This shared cruelty becomes their twisted form of intimacy, their version of connection. And these partnerships, they typically take one of two forms. The most common is the dominant submissive pair. You've got one partner, usually a man, who's the clear leader, and the other person participates mainly to please them and keep that bond alive. A little less common are the equally dominant teams, where both partners are actively, enthusiastically all in, and they often weave the crimes right into their own relationship. And man, you can see this transference in some absolutely chilling real-world cases. The dominant partner's specific trauma directly decides who the team's victims will be. Kenneth Bianchi's history of rejection by women led the Hillside Stranglers to target young women. Ian Brady's humiliation by his school peers led the Moors murderers to target kids. Paul Bernardo's rage at his mother's affair led him and Carla Homolka to target virgins. The partnership basically takes a private trauma and turns it into a shared, lethal mission. So this partnership, it works for them on a few crucial levels. Psychologically, their darkest fantasies are finally getting validated. Practically, hey, it's just plain easier for two people to lure and control a victim than one. And maybe most importantly, there is now an audience. That act of regaining power, which used to be just a lonely fantasy, is now a performance for a significant other. And that makes it real, and it validates the killer's sense of control. But here's the thing about these bonds that are forged in cruelty and trauma. They are incredibly unstable. The same psychological forces that create them, well, they also contain the seeds of their own destruction.
The whole alliance is built on one fundamental human need: connection. But it's eventually torn apart by another equally powerful need that smashes right into it.
Let's just walk through the 4 stages of how this all falls apart. First, the bond is created over that desperate shared need for connection. But then, as the external pressure starts to build, the police are getting closer, or maybe the dominant partner becomes abusive, a new conflicting need pops up: the need for security, self-preservation. And all of a sudden, that powerful need to save your own skin becomes stronger than the need to keep the bond. And that leads directly to the final step. One partner betrays the other, and they get caught. That theory of the relational self actually explains this perfectly. When the threat to your own life or your own freedom gets bad enough, the psychological drive is to just sever the connection, even with the most important person in your life, as a pure self-protective move. The partnership that was an asset is now a liability. So all of this leaves us with a really chilling paradox, doesn't it? The human need for connection can get so twisted that it helps create a monster. And yet, the equally human need for self-preservation is what finally brings that monster down. It really makes you wonder, in the darkest corners of human psychology, which one of our fundamental needs is truly the most powerful?